Excellent. Alrighty, so again, welcome to the NordSalt Final Symposium. We have about an hour and a half set aside to go over all the great things that we've done in the project, and we have time at the end for the question and answer. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of recommendations and maybe some ground rules. So first and foremost, for those of you who may or may not be familiar with Zoom, in the top right corner of your screen, you should see a view button. If you click on the view button, you can choose how the presenters show up. And we recommend that you choose the speaker or the side-by-side speaker view. This way you can see the person who's presenting as well as the slides on the screen. If you can't figure this out or it's not working for you, it's perfectly fine. You'll still be able to see the screen and hear the person speaking. So for today, we're going to go through a very brief overview of the agenda. We will have a welcome introduction from Gary Banta, the project leader for NordSalt from the University of Southern Denmark. Then we will go through with updates from each of the teams. It's an international collaborative project. So we'll hear from each of the teams in the course of about an hour. And then about the last 30 minutes of the event, we're going to have our town hall, which is like a question answer session. So we just ask that you save your questions until the end. The recording will be stopped for the town hall, so you don't have to worry about any concerns there with asking your question out loud. You can also write your question in the chat if you wish. But for now, we're asking that you save your questions until the very end of the event. And then once we get to the town hall, you can raise your virtual hand or place an X in the chat, and we'll call on you to ask your question. And then we'll have our team who will do their best to respond or let you know what their thoughts are on the subject matter. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Gary Banta.
Great. And next slide, Jake. Thanks, Jake, for that welcome. And thank you, everyone. It's great to see so many people attending. And welcome. And thank you for your interest in our NordSalt project. So I get to tell you a little bit what NordSalt is all about. And NordSalt is a project looking at climate impacts and biodiversity interactions in Nordic coastal marshes. And in fact, NordSalt was funded by the EU Biodiversa BioClim project about biodiversity and climate interactions. And one of the reasons we focused on this is that Nordic coastal marshes are very diverse, as you can see some pictures of here, and a little different than some of the classic coastal salt marshes that we know a lot about. So this is one of the reasons we wanted to look at this. And one of the things that's really important in these areas is that management practices are common, including grazing. So what I want to do now is go on and look at, yeah, please, next slide, Jake. So I want to try to present the overall goals of the project in sort of an overview. So next. And the main goal is to look at interactions between biodiversity and ecological functioning. But we approached this from a multidisciplinary way. One of the important tasks was to look at how stakeholders view these habitats. We also wanted to look at the, oh, sorry, it's going backwards, Jake, thanks. We also want to look at the distribution of these habitats. We also wanted to look at especially climate-related carbon cycling processes going on. So next, Jake. We also wanted to look at how these habitats are changing over time and what kind of local management or other pressures are involved. Next. Big part of the project was looking at carbon cycling processes that are related to climate interactions like carbon storage and greenhouse gases, and relate this to how the plant communities are structured. And finally, what ecosystem services, climate and otherwise, are being provided by these. And finally, to come with recommendations to what extent these could be used as nature-based solutions. How do we do this? It's sort of summarized in this graphic, and I won't go into detail here because we will meet it during the following presentations, but the overall approach, which is important, is we had some case study sites located in the different Nordic countries, and also including Germany. And at these case study sites, we did a lot of things at all case study sites, and at a few case study sites, we did even more. And we will meet the different methodologies as we go along. They're sort of summarized by the icons or symbols at the top, which you will see on some of the following presentations. An important design feature is that all these case study sites, we were comparing grazed locations to ungrazed, as this is one of the most common and important management practices in these coastal marshes and meadow areas. So next slide, please, Jake. And as Jake mentioned, this has been an international team. We have representatives from all of the Nordic countries, and including Germany, where we also have been collaborating with our colleagues from University of Hamburg, and have been in charge of one of the important experimental methodologies we use, which you'll hear about in a minute. So the team has grown during the last 3 years, and it's been great fun to work with such an international team, and also a good excuse to visit different sites in the Nordic region. So next slide, please. And to sort of organize the presentations from each of the teams and our main results, we've decided to organize around these 5 major result themes. And we're going to look at, and we're going to start by handing off to Chris Bostrom from Obo Academy, who's going to talk about distributions and classifications of Nordic salt marshes. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Gary. Next slide. So yes, hello from my side too. I had the pleasure to work with a wonderful and fantastic team the past 2-3 years, and where Anu Vehma has been the principal investigator here, along with me and Mika von Numers, our plant expert. We had also a great collaboration with Jukka Alm from the Natural Resource Institute on the greenhouse gas fluxes. And also, of course, Heli Jutila, who is an expert on these habitats since a long time ago and helped us a lot with these species lists and where to find these habitats and so forth. So really great team. Thank you. Next slide. So we really started off on a very, very basic level. We wanted to know in this project, where are the salt marshes located? How much is there of this habitat type or these habitat types, I would say? Can we observe any long-term changes in these systems? And one main hurdle have been to learn to know how these are classified and managed in Nordic countries. So this habitat type consists of some 180 to 200 marsh vascular plant species. So it's not a simple complex by no means. It's presently classified into 2 major classes, the EU classification and the EUNIS, which are running parallel. And in addition to those, there are these habitats can be found in the European red lists. And in addition to these, there's ongoing nationally existing unique, more or less unique or uncoordinated wild typologies in different countries, which makes the whole big picture very blurry, I would say. Next slide. So starting off with how do they look like? So this is my first example. It's come from Germany. So we have fully saline tidal marshes in the southern Baltic Sea, shown here in these different examples. Next slide. In Finland, we also have a very diverse set of coastal marshes. They are grazed by cows or sheep. They might be vast wetlands, they might be on the mainland, they might be small coastal meadows in the archipelago, and so forth. So very, very diverse in how they look like and function. Next. The same is true for Norway, similar to Finland and Sweden, I would say. You can see the different types of importance of seawater and how wet they are or how dry they are on this slide. Next. Fun fact here is actually that in Norway alone, there's over 25 names for the same habitat, like Brakkvannseng or Sumpstrand or these Norwegian names for more or less the same habitat. And this has inspired NIVA to actually write a really good report on the topic. And it's entitled, Do We Actually Have Salt Marshes in Norway? And I really recommend this as additional reading to the products NordSalt has produced. Next slide. So we have in our team here worked with a simple term called coastal marsh, and that spans all these different habitat classes, and that has been our working term also in the manuscript we have produced. Next slide. So how much is there of this habitat? So a little bit less than 2,000 square kilometers. This is no easy task to compile. Anu has done an excellent work here and hours in GIS and looking into databases, looking into classes and so forth. The countries differs in a little bit in different ways. The 1630 class is quite big in Finland. There's more of this also in Sweden. Some classes are not found in some countries. There's different types in Denmark than in Finland due to the salinity and so forth. But we end up something around 1,850 square kilometers of this habitat, which does really show that it's not a minor habitat type in the coastlines of Scandinavia. Next slide. We also had a really engaged method in the way that we wanted to interact with the managers, or actually those people who work a lot with salt marshes. And we sent out questionnaires, we had them in workshops and so forth. And what is really clear from this work is that there's big knowledge gaps for managers regarding how they actually should work in these systems. How should I manage my marsh? What is the importance of my coastal marsh for carbon sequestration, for example, for nutrients and climate change mitigations and so forth? These are concerns that the managers presently have. And actually, when we are asking, is salt marsh extent surveyed with an accurate accuracy? The answers are all over the place. I don't know. There's a lot of I don't knows and a lot of no. There's some yeses, yeah, but overall there seems to be not enough data and some confusion about the major functions of these systems. And that's why NordSalt really comes in here and contributes a lot with this to fill these knowledge gaps. Next slide. So to put a really long and complex story super short, the problems have been that the classification and management have been very fragmented. It still is. It's very inconsistent in a way, confusing and unclear. And really the wide EU classification do not capture the Nordic diversity of these marshes in a good way. And there's also big differences in how much a country invests in mapping and monitoring of these systems. So we have a couple of simple solutions. Create simple subtypes to the 1630 habitat type called Baltic Boreal or Boreal Coastal Meadows. This would capture the diversity and the uniqueness of the Botnian Bay habitats, for example. And we want a simple hierarchical system based on the function of these habitats. And we stand on much better ground now after NordSalt about the function. And also a harmonized and more frequent monitoring is needed in order to observe change. So we believe that all this would stimulate the management and actually continue after NordSalt to facilitate comparative research and actually helping in comparison of the status of these valuable ecosystems. Next slide. So those of you who are really salt marsh nerds or otherwise interested in harmonization of classification, please have a look at this paper. It came out last week. Really thorough summary of the situation I just briefly had time to go through. Next slide. And then we also have some really interesting stuff in preparation regarding the greenhouse gas fluxes in Finnish and Danish coastal sites. And with these words, I open the floor for Carmen and Dorte, who has really some interesting results already about the fluxes of CO2 and methane. So thank you for my side and take it away, Dorte.
Thank you. Yes, and from the Aarhus University team, we are Carmen Leiva Duenas and Francesca Ella and myself. And next slide, please. Our responsibility has been to assess the carbon stocks and accumulation rates in the sediments, and also the measurements of greenhouse gases. We've done this in Denmark and collated information from the other countries in collaboration with the other teams. And Carmen has been the key person in collating all this information. So I give the word to Carmen to continue this part of the presentation.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes, so the methods we use are quite standard within the blue carbon field. We collected soil cores using 1 meter plexiglass tubes that we hammered into the soil. And we also assessed above ground and below ground biomass, but today I'm just focusing on the soil. And we assessed as well the greenhouse gas fluxes from the soil to the atmosphere with a LICOR infrared detector. Next slide, please. With the data we compiled, we got 3 main variables about which I will be talking today. The first one is the amount of organic carbon stored from the surface to 1 meter depth in the soil. Next. And within that 1 meter stock, we tried to differentiate how much is actually attributed to the presence of the salt marsh on site and how much is from a time before the salt marsh colonized the area. A seabed, which are usually the bottom layers that are more muddy and sandy. Next, please. The second main variable are the accumulation rates, the speed at which the organic carbon is entering into the soil over the last 100 of years, and that we could calculate thanks to lead to 10 dating over the top 30 centimeters of soil. Next, please. And the last variable that I will be talking about are the methane emissions from the soil to the atmosphere that were measured over 4 to 5 campaigns along 1 year. And every time we measured during 2-3 days at different light intensities. Next, please. So I start with the soil organic carbon stocks. Next. And here are the results for the 1 meter stock. And you have in brown how much of that stock we believe is from the salt marsh, and how much is from a basal pre-salt marsh habitat. And there was, although we could see a tendency towards higher stocks at graze areas in Denmark and in Finland, that was not observed in Norway and Sweden. So across countries, when taking all together, there's no significant difference between grazed and ungrazed, although Norway showed higher stocks compared to some of the other countries. Next, please. When we average all of the stocks for our study sites, for the top 30 centimeters, we have 8.3 kilograms per square meter, and compared to values in the literature from other salt marshes around the world, our average is in a middle high position. Next, please. About accumulation rates. Next. We did not see a significant difference between grazed and ungrazed or between countries. Next. And when we average the values we obtained and compare that to literature values, in this case, the Nordic salt marshes are in the lower end of the range. Next, please. About methane emissions, we only measured these emissions in Denmark and Finland, and we could see opposite patterns. We saw higher methane emissions at the ungrazed area of the salt marsh in Denmark, but these emissions were higher at the grazed area in Finland. And with these values from 5 campaigns, we tried to estimate the annual flux. Next, please. Which are the following. Next, sorry. Here you can see these annual fluxes that we estimated of methane expressed in tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare and year. And again, the opposite pattern, and also highlight the fact that the fluxes are significantly higher in Finland compared to Denmark, which is attributed to the fact that the coastal waters in Finland have way lower salinities. And when we compare these output fluxes from the soil to the input fluxes of carbon, the accumulation rates, next please, we can see that the Danish study site could be considered a sink of greenhouse gases into the soil, while in Finland it's a little bit more tight, the balance between the output and the input flux. And to these fluxes outside and inside the soil, we need to consider also the fact that the cows are also emitting methane. And when we add up to these fluxes, the methane from the cows on our sites, we can see that the gray soil marshes would be actually having a negative impact on the climate, being sources of CO2. Next, please. Next, in our team, we also compile data from the literature. Here, I'm just showing all of the annual methane emissions we compiled for Germany, Denmark, and Finland, and how they relate to the sea surface salinity is the widely acknowledged negative exponential relationship. So we confirm salinity is a main driver of methane emissions in the soil marshes of the Nordic area. And because of this, next please, when we attempt to upscale our values, evaluate the annual mitigation potential of these habitats, we can see that for Sweden and Finland, the soil marshes have the lowest net mitigation potential. Next, please. And just to conclude, the 3 take-home messages would be that grazing appears to have minimal impact, according to our data, on the soil organic carbon of Nordic soil marshes. However, when we take into account methane released by cows, that turns the gray soil marshes into net greenhouse gas emitters. Next. The organic carbon stocks from Nordic soil marshes at the top layers seems significant at the global context. However, the rate at which this organic carbon has been accumulated over the last 100 years is low at the global context. Next. And salinity is a main driver of methane emissions from the soil, making Finland and Sweden the countries where soil marshes have the lowest potential for climate mitigation. Next slide, please. Next, through the animations. With all of the data we have so far and the data that we still are waiting to get in this project and data from the literature, next 2 animations. We would like to upscale using a spatial modeling, relating our data to spatial environmental covariates. So we can have an overview at a wider spatial scale of the variability. And so far we have been able to do this for the Danish country, because we managed to get a lot of data for the organic carbon stocks. And this is something we expect to submit and publish very soon. And that is all from my side. I hand over to Johan, who will be talking about biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Carmen. So my name is Johan Eklöf, and I'm the lead of the Biodiversity and Plant Community Structure package. I represent Team Sweden. Could you please mute your phone or turn off your microphone? Thank you. And I represent Team Stockholm, consisting of myself, postdoc Anais Richard, and we've also been supported by Sara Cassins from the Natural Geography Department. Next, please. So our work package and the work we've been doing has been focusing on the role of plant biodiversity, both how plant diversity is influenced by, first and foremost, grazing across this vast climate and salinity gradient, but also how biodiversity, as opposed to, for example, variation in abiotic conditions, could influence both carbon stocks as well as the stabilization of soils by these plant communities. Next. So one of the first activities that we did from an ecological perspective in the project is this core site survey that Carmen presented the carbon stock results from. In these 4 paired ungrazed and grazed sites, we also conducted a standardized plant community survey, looking at plant above and below ground biomass, plant canopy height, as well as the composition and diversity of the communities. On the graphs here, you see the species richness average per plot level across these 4 different pairs of sites. What we're seeing is that in terms of plant above ground biomass, grazing unsurprisingly reduces plant above ground biomass and plant height. When we look at biodiversity, both in terms of species richness and other measures such as the Shannon index, we see no consistent effect of grazing on plant diversity. In Sweden, for example, here, as you see on the top left, we're seeing a strongly positive influence on grazing. In Finland, there's no significant results. In Norway, there's no significant results. In Denmark, we actually have a lower species richness in the grazed than ungrazed areas. A big question here is, of course, whether this lack of a general effect is a true general lack of effect, or if what we're seeing here is a strong influence of site-specific conditions that sort of override the general effect, and that we have too few sites to actually capture a general effect of grazing on diversity. Next. We also looked at plant community composition. What you see here is a multidimensional scaling ordination plot, where each of the points represent an individual sampling plot, and the distance between the plots correspond to how similar or dissimilar they are in terms of species composition. So 2 points that are close to each other are points that are very similar in species composition, and vice versa. So what we're seeing here is a general effect of grazing, where grazing tends to favor short herbs and grasses and suppresses large species like Phragmites australis. Whereas then, on the contrary, the absence of grazing strongly favors tall growing grasses, for primarily Phragmites. We also see a strong difference between countries that largely follows the sort of salinity gradient that we see along the coast. In Denmark, particularly, we see several unique species suggesting, and these are true, sort of common, true salt marsh species that would be found in more saline areas, suggesting that the Danish site is more influenced by marine conditions than all of the 3 other core sites. We also see a strong interaction effect here, that grazing effects on composition seems to be weaker in the Finnish core site than in the other countries. However, we want to emphasize that this data then only comes from these 4 paired of grazed sites. It's a relatively small data set. Next, please. So to dive more deeply into this potential role of plant communities, both their diversity and their composition from a functional perspective, especially linking plant communities to carbon stocks, we realized very early on that we needed to have much more data than just the data we gathered from these core sites. So in 2023, we conducted an additional site survey that essentially extends this environmental gradient going up into the Bothnian Bay, and it nearly triples the number of sites that we have gathered all in all. The preliminary results of this data suggest that grazing actually then generally increases species richness in these areas, even though there's some differences in some of the sites. And we are in the progress now of going deeper into this data, in the process of linking then grazing and abiotic conditions, for example, salinity, to both plant communities and plant diversity. And then going to be using different types of causal modeling tools to look at how these factors then indirectly influence carbon stocks. Next, please. One of the other goals of the NordSalt project was to look at how grazing and these plant communities also affect other services, in particular then soil stabilization, which is an important process that is often contributed by these coastal plant communities. And is especially important in times of increased storminess and increased sea levels in these coastal areas. So in 2021, we conducted a sampling in 3 pairs of grazed and ungrazed sites in the Stockholm site, in the Swedish site north of Stockholm, south of Stockholm. And this was done in 2 different elevations, the low and high marsh zone. And we measured a soil shear strength using a hand vane, as you see in the photograph here. And we've now been analyzing this data using causal structural equation modeling. Next, please. What we see here is a web of direct and indirect effects. We were finding that if we start looking from the left, grazing, which is strongly correlated to plant community composition, so strongly that we can't really tease apart their relative influences in this data. So grazing and plant community composition influences plant richness. It also has a negative influence on soil salinity, most likely by the fact that areas that are ungrazed have not as a compact seabed, which retains more water and therefore also retains more salt. And we're seeing that this actually has a weakly non-significant influence on plant richness, emphasizing how grazing really influences not just plant communities, but also abiotic conditions in these habitats. We're seeing that plant richness has a positive influence on root biomass. Grazing and plant community composition also influences soil bulk density. And these factors then in turn finally influences soil shear strength, which is also responding to whether we are in the high zone or low zone of the area. But this is still preliminary results, and this data together with also the data on carbon stocks will be used to all in all shed a more in-depth view on the functional role of these plant communities in terms of influencing both soil stabilization and carbon stocks. Next. And with that, I hand over to Team Hamburg and Kai Jensen.
Yes, thank you, Johan. I'm Kai Jensen. I'm representing Team Hamburg or Team Germany in this consortium here. And the team here at our university consists of Simon Thomsen and Ella Logemann. And so far we have learned now that these coastal marshes exist, that there are many different types of these coastal marshes, that they are important for carbon storage and that they also play a role for biodiversity conservation. Our question was then to answer how they behave or are affected by climate change. And for that, we're setting up a mesocosm warming experiment, and this will be represented by Ella Logemann. So I hand over to Ella, to you. Please take over, Ella.
Yes, next, please. Okay. As Kai already mentioned, we talk a lot about these ecosystems as a climate mitigation ecosystem. So, of course, it is urgent to also consider the climate change in these. And this is what I did during my PhD. I investigated the different Nordic salt marsh origins in the mesocosm settings. And today I will show you some data on the methane emission. And therefore, I would like to start why it is actually important to include these in the blue carbon budget. Next. So methane has a higher radiative forcing than carbon dioxide. And even though it is much less abundant in the atmosphere, it accounts to 16 to 25% of the atmospheric warming. And wetlands play a crucial role since they account for half of the global methane emission. So the methane emission can even level out the overall blue carbon effect we just learned about. But also I want to mention that this number is also accounting the terrestrial ecosystem. So it's not only those systems that we just learned about. Next. So methane emission is a complex ecosystem response indicated by this graph here. So what we measure is usually what comes out of the soil. So the outcome of production versus consumption. So both processes are happening in the soil. And the main drivers on this is the water content. So first of all, like if there's water saturation, it's promoting the production of methane. And if there's not so much water available and oxygen available, then we might even have the consumption of methane. And of course, this is also linked to the substrate availability, which is mostly controlled by plants, because they can put into the soil the rhizodeposits or other organic compounds. Next. And here again, I don't want you to dive too much into the graph, but I just want to imply with that it's very complex to add now the warming effect, since it is happening on a multifold of levels. So first of all, it can change, for example, the plant composition or changes plant traits, which might change the substrate availability. but then also it can affect directly the biogeochemical settings, for example, through leading to a higher aeration of the soil, so maybe promoting the oxidation of methane, but also it can directly affect the microbes itself. So, for example, the methane-producing microbes, they are more sensitive to temperature than the one that consume methane. So it is hard to link it to just one direction. So it's not easy to just hypothesize, for example, that warming increases methane emission, but this is at the moment the leading hypothesis. Next. So what we did, we took the different soil enrichments as soil blocks from Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, and transplanted them into the mesocosm experiment, into a pool here. And we considered both the grazed communities and the ungrazed communities. Grazed ones usually dominated by halophytes, and the ungrazed by reed beds dominated by Phragmites. And then next, we added in a block design also the different warming treatments. So we went in 1.5 degree steps, and what we have here is in general like a very clever system, because it's a feedback control system. So it's always adding a plus to the regarding plot. And this leads that we not only grab like the bigger diurnal changes, that we also can grab like the smaller diurnal changes throughout the day. Next. So this is my very first results that I can share with you today. So what we see here is, first of all, the different origins. And I want you to look only into the Swedish and Finnish graphs now. So the two different green shades, they indicate the management. And what we see in the Swedish and Finnish plots is that there is a higher methane emission in the ungrazed plots, and even slightly an uptake in the grazed ones. Also, there's not a significant difference in the methane emission itself between the countries, but between management. And now the Danish plots do show a much higher emission in methane, and also don't show the same trend. So what happened here is we, first of all, Carmen already showed the field data, and there we had a different pattern. So there we actually had Finnish plots with higher methane emission. And also she mentioned the salinity. So I told you earlier that we put all of the plots into the same pool. So it also has all the same salinity. So we decrease the salinity for the Danish plots. And this is probably also what we can assume here. And for explaining this a little bit further, I want you to go to the next slide, please, and take it into the field. So what we had beforehand was a sink, carbon sink for the natural or like functioning coastal marsh. And now we disturb the whole system by changing the hydrology or the salinity, which is happening a lot also throughout management, that you, for example, change the hydrology of the marshes through diking. And this in return can create a source, so make a carbon sink to carbon source, which is maybe really important to consider in further management questions. And also, I want to emphasize here that the carbon, so the Danish plots had a high organic layer, that the carbon that is stored there is only preserved by the conditions and not intrinsically stabilized. So it is sensitive to disturbance. Next, please. So lastly, I want to show you also the preliminary data on the warming effect. So what you see here indicated by the different colors. So the darker the red gets, the warmer the warming treatment. And what we see here, first of all, is that, to keep a long story short, that there's no clear warming effect. But next, please, I'm not willing to leave it like this for now. So in general, I think it is good, because what would have been expected is that we see an increase in methane emission, but so far there's no clear effect. But this is maybe also due to the very preliminary data, and that it's only, this graph is only including a subset of the data that I sampled. And also I haven't included any environmental data yet. And also I want to point out that maybe there is some kind of trend visible that definitely needs further investigation, which I would describe as a W-shaped trend. So we have like a decrease, increase, decrease, increase, which is also repeating itself in the different origins. So maybe there is more behind it. And this could maybe because of the, as I mentioned before, it's a complex ecosystem response. So maybe this is why we don't really see a clear pattern here. Next. And to wrap that up, so we do have high emission, much higher emission in the Danish plots, which might indicate that the carbon is only preserved by the coastal marsh and not intrinsically stabilized and thus sensitive to disturbance. And that also contradictory to what we measured in the field, the grazing decreased methane emission in Swedish and Finnish plots, and that I could not tell or could not see at the moment that there is a clear warming effect, but this might be due to the complexity of methane being an ecosystem response. Yes, and with that, I would like to hand over to Rachel Tiller, who will talk more about the MAL workshops.
Thank you, Ella. Jake, you can switch the slide. Thank you so much. So my name is Rachel Tiller. I'm a chief scientist at Sintef Ocean, which is located in Trondheim in Norway, the middle part of Norway. I'm here with my colleague Anne, who will be coming in and talking a little bit about some survey results we have. But first, I'm just going to introduce a little bit to what it is that we did with stakeholders during this project. Now, we were fortunate enough that Gary was very foresighted in wanting to include a very large segment on stakeholder integration. And it's become increasingly important, it's become increasingly acknowledged how important it is. I've been having participatory stakeholder workshops since my postdoc in the beginning of a long time ago. And I met stakeholders in both semi-formal and formal settings across the world since then. And it's becoming increasingly critical, as we have seen in many of these global agreements that are out as well right now. So our focus here at Sintef on this work package is on stakeholders and on political ecology, which is studying the relationship between political, economic, and social factors when it comes to environmental issues. So how different power relations can drive environmental change, and especially within this context of an interconnected world, and how there's a large difference between local communities and how they implement things at a global, that are agreed on at a global level. So next. What we wanted to do then was to look into all these different countries that we have as part of this project and delve into the minds of those that are local stakeholders and that have an opinion and a stake in that of Nordic salt marshes. What we did started with, and recall that this project started up at in very, very beginning of COVID. It was the first time that we at Sintef had ever done an online workshop, probably first of many across the world, because workshops are generally the best when you can do them in person. So we started off having a workshop just with the internal participants of this project to focus in on the drivers, what we were going to focus on asking these different stakeholders, because we want to make sure that the methodology we use was cross-applicable to all the different case areas. So it doesn't help to just have a whole bunch of workshops if you can't compare them afterwards. So we needed the same methodology. And to ensure that we had that, we also want to make sure we started off at the same starting point. So the drivers that we ended up with, and you've heard some of them mentioned throughout these presentations today, were grazing, water levels, climatic stressors, nutrient levels, human manipulation, and governance. So if you, that QR code up in the code there will give you a direct link to an open access article that brings in this first part of it, looking at these stakeholders that were scientific experts within this project, trying to just set the boundaries of where we were going to move on to this. So we had workshops in all these different places across Europe. We had them first a general workshop with stakeholders, starting off with stakeholder mapping, where we went to each of the case areas and had a large, a fairly comprehensive meeting where we assigned roles to different stakeholders. Who are the important, powerful ones? Who are the unimportant stakeholders in terms of they're having a low interest and a low set of powers? And who are those that are super interested but have no power, like scientists very often? And who are those that are very powerful but couldn't care less? Those are the ones you really want to get over to the part of the workshops. You want them interested. So we did that, and then we had this first set of workshops across all these different areas. And then towards the end of the project, we had an iterative workshop with the same or similar stakeholders that we had in the first time, where we presented the results of the first one, first workshop, talked a little bit about results during the project, and then gave them the opportunity to make changes. Because people are sort of like fish stocks in that sense. You don't just count the fish once and then say, well, that's how much we have. Stakeholders also have changing settings, changing circumstances, and we've seen a lot of that in this project. So that was the stakeholder workshops. I now want to give it over to Anne, who's going to talk about these surveys. So Jake, if you can change the slide.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the surveys that we did. So we fielded surveys in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Germany, so all the NordSalt countries. And we used a company to send out the survey for us. So they did a representative sample in each of these countries. There was approximately 5,000 respondents in total, with 1,000 respondents in each country. So quite a large sample size. In each country, we split down those 1,000 respondents into two groups, two panels. The first panel received a biodiversity framing text saying that salt marshes are important areas for biodiversity. And the second framing text saying that salt marshes are important for climate change mitigation. And then after that, respondents received 3 different scenarios targeting different elements of willingness to pay. So the first scenario that they received was that one about a house value. So targeting if they would be willing to reduce their house value by cutting or by leaving reeds that block the view to their house. And then the second one was a scenario was about conservation, and if they would be willing to move their swimming spot in order to conserve salt marsh. And then the third one was about a dike, if they would be willing to have a slight increase in their tax to support taking down a dike to let the salt marsh expand. And each of these scenarios was presented as having an impact on either climate change or biodiversity, depending on the panel that the respondent was in. The overarching goal of the survey was to see if citizens value climate change mitigation over biodiversity protection, and to see what factors influence respondents' support for the different management initiatives. We have some interesting results, which were just recently published in Ocean and Coastal Management on Sunday. So we hope you check out our article. So I'll just talk briefly about those results. So the first result is that respondents were generally supportive of all of these 3 different management initiatives, and that the support was the greatest for the one that talked about the swimming area, and then second greatest for the one about the house, and then the third greatest for the one about taxation. So these 3 scenarios generally received great support, but the ones that had most direct monetary contribution received the least support, so the one on taxation. Another interesting finding is that there was generally very little difference between the 2 panels. However, for the scenario on the house and the reeds, so the first scenario, respondents who received the biodiversity priming were slightly more supportive of the initiative than those who received the climate change mitigation priming. Another interesting finding was that knowledge of salt marshes was generally very low across all of the countries, less than 50%, and it was highest in Finland. And in general, the support differed based on country, with respondents in Germany being much more supportive than respondents in other countries, as well as on age and gender. So those are the results, and we're hopeful that you'll check out our article.
Thank you. Jake, next. So just to sum it up, because what Anne was saying here is really important in terms of these being the local, real on, like, what are they willing to do? Because we also participated in global governance arenas, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and following up on their global biodiversity framework throughout this. It's that QR code gets to the overview of all the articles we've published. So next, Jake. Because the important thing here is, as Anne was bringing up, and as we noticed, and as also Chris was bringing up, there's a lot of differences between these different areas that we are in during the NordSalt project, but also in the fact that at these global biodiversity arenas, there's a lot of very big, high ambitions. But when you come down to translating it, you have owners of these fields that have their own agendas. You also have a political horizon in local communities throughout the world that is much smaller than that of the global ambitions and the needs. So when you look at 100-year perspectives at the global level, and even in some of our studies, when it comes down to local politicians, they have a 3 to 4 year perspective in terms of whether or not they'll be reelected. Regular people have a perspective of whether or not they'll have an income. So these are like some of the real things that we went through and discussed during these workshops. And I'm going to hand it back over to Gary now to sum up, but I'd love for you to follow some of our articles and give us some feedback on those. Thank you.
Great. Next, Jake. Great. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for presenting those nice overall results. I guess I would like to come back and try to summarize, coming back to these overall themes. So in regard to stakeholder engagement, we found out that knowledge was missing, information was missing, but they were very interested, and that in general, biodiversity was slightly more interesting than climate is possibly a trend. Next, please. We clearly have recommendations about trying to get a more coherent classification overview, including changing monitoring types. And among the things we meet in a little bit more categories to get more details, and we also at times are missing reed beds. We didn't characterize pressures per se, the third point, but we did a lot of focus on the role of management, especially grazing. But one of the topics that kept coming up also is the role of managing water is an important thing to look at as well. So how we manage these habitats is one of the things that will affect how they are distributed and how they perform. Next, please. We did do a lot of work on quantifying the carbon side of climate mitigation, and especially looked at stocks and sequestration rate and net greenhouse gases. And we heard from how we're placed locally with relatively moderate levels of stocks, but low rates of sequestration, and that we clearly need to look at greenhouse gases as part of the story, and that livestock need to be included in that equation. Going on to the plant, oh, sorry, Jake's going back. Yeah, going back to the plant, we know that biomass and plant contribution is strongly influenced by grazing. We're trying to look at how this relates to specific ecosystem services, and Johan presented one nice example of looking at sediment stability as one proxy for ecosystem services. Moving on to ecosystem services in general, we know that these habitats provide important ecosystem services for coastal protection and to some extent climate regulation, habitat provision, biodiversity support, and recreation. But quantification is a difficult task, so we're continuing to work together with my postdoc Mariana Leonare on how to quantify those things. And finally, we're on the cusp to try to see how we might make recommendations to manipulate these habitats in a nature-based solution context. So far, this has been looking at natural or non-manipulated ecosystems from a perspective of whether we would change their practice from a climate or biodiversity perspective. But that's clearly the next step. Finally, okay, next slide, please, Jake. Thanks. So key outputs, we've already shown that we've produced some papers that are already coming out, so we're quite happy about that. More will be coming, clearly, but scientific papers have been coming out, as you've heard, about most of these topics, as well as we've managed to participate in some different conferences and workshops and produce some also recommendation papers, so take a look for some of those. On our homepage, you can follow some of the blogs which have shown daily activities or activities along the life of the consortium, which has been quite fun. So if you want to go back a historical view of what we've been up to, you can go and look at some of our blogs. And I believe the last thing is finally we have made a policy brief as a recommendation to policymakers that's also available. So if you'd like to find any of our outputs, please come to our homepage where you can see our publications, and under the recommendations ones, you can see a link to the policy brief. So more is coming for sure. As you know, publications can be slower than doing the science, so we're still working on getting some of those out, but we're quite happy with what's already out. Next slide. So I'd like to end by, first of all, sending a big shout out and thanks to our very engaged Scientific Advisory Board. Thank you very much for your interest, your support, your at times critical questions, and your excellent dialogues during the course of our consortium life. We've been really happy for your input and your guidance. Appreciate that a lot. Next slide. And of course, thank you very much to the funding agencies which made this project possible. First of all, to the EU Biodiversity Program, and it's a co-fund project, so then it's also matched by national funding agencies that you can see here. This project would not, of course, been possible without these funding agencies, so we thank you very much for your support. Next, please. And so finally, this has been a great group to work with. We've had a lot of fun. We've also gotten tired and muddy and dirty together, but we would just like to say thank you very much for your time and your attention and for listening to us, and we've had a good time. So thank you for joining us today. And with that, if you want to follow and stay in touch, we have a homepage, which you can see here, and we also occasionally tweet, or X, or whatever it's called these days, but we have an account there, so you can see some activities there as stuff comes out. And finally, we'd like to move on now to the town hall part. I've seen there's some questions that have come in now, but I will turn over the instructions about how we do the town hall to Jake again. So thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you everybody for participating in our final symposium. Now I will stop the recording.